Nationalism brought us Brexit. It also ushered in Donald Trump. It threatens the stability of the entire European project, and it has allowed for the rise of autocrats around the world. The question is why? Why nationalism? My next guest answers the question in a brilliant new Foreign Affairs article, This is Your Brain on Nationalism. Robert Sapolsky is a professor of biology and neurology at Stanford. Welcome, Professor.
No, thanks for having me on.
So you say that the idea of sort of separating ourselves into kind of from an us versus a them, finding another to dislike, is almost hardwired into our brains. Explain.
When you look at the neurobiology of how we process us's versus them, there's some incredibly hardwired stuff going on. Flash up faces of people that somebody has categorized as either an in-group or an out-group, and in a fraction of a second, your brain is differentiating between them. If it's a them, parts of your brain that are related to fear, aggression, disgust activate. Parts of your brain that normally process faces don't activate as much as normal. Parts of your brain related to empathy don't activate as much as normal if it's a them. We've got this gigantic fault line in our heads as to who counts as an in-group member, who evokes empathy, who evokes concern, and who's a them who just gets us bristling.
And you talk about how it's very easy as a result of this dynamic to scapegoat. You say scapegoating is a kind of very human response.
Well, there's an area called the insula. The insula, if you're a normal mammal, what it does is tell you if you've bitten into some disgusting food. It keeps you from getting poisoned. And in humans it does that, but in addition, it also activates at morally disgusting acts, at people whose actions we consider to be disgusting. What it does is give this tremendous viscera to who we think is appallingly different. And what that winds up meaning is we're incredibly easy to propagandize into thems as vermin, thems as malignancies, thems as cockroaches, all these historical examples of genocides being built around sort of dehumanizing thems. And basically, if you're some autocratic tyrant, if you can get your followers to activate the insular cortex as soon as they contemplate the thems, you've just checked off half of your to-do list on your ethnic cleansing shopping list.
You know, you've studied this all and very deeply, but you also talk about how you've come to this even personally. You grew up in a very small, insular Jewish community that was suspicious often of the outside world. Is this something that one can do anything about?
Well, there's some good news lurking in there. It's some very fragile good news, but it's one of the ways in which we're different from your typical chimp or baboon going about an us-them dichotomy. We belong to multiple groups. We belong to multiple groups, and thus we have multiple thems in our heads, and who counts as a them could change in a fraction of a second.
So the hope is that we kind of embrace the idea that everybody has multiple identities, where we belong to many different groups, that no one can, people can't just be put into a box. Is that right?
Well, the hope is that could be used for good. Of course, we have no endless shortage of examples of it being used for the worst. During the Rwandan genocide, Tutsi and Hutu people there who had been neighbors for years, suddenly a neighbor, a classmate, a student, a parishioner, all of those were transformed into a them thanks to the propaganda of that. Insofar as we are a smart species that could juggle lots of categories in our heads at once, we are a species that could be terribly vulnerable to manipulation. I think it's fair to say we are fairly hardwired into dividing the world into us's and thems, and not being very thrilled about the thems, but who counts as an us and who counts as a them could change in a fraction of a second.
Wow, sobering stuff. Professor Sapolsky, pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me on.